where can I start, man? There's so much that you guys have done, but give us a little history about the collective banking group as it was back then, and you know how you've come from 1992, really, and where you plan to go. You know, we just want to have a little fireside chat here at 6 Acres, just to inform the people of Cincinnati, and in fact across the nation, because this will be on the internet as well.
Well, thank you, Jim. You're absolutely right. This whole movement had some fire put to it back in the early 1990s. I had just come to Prince George's County, Maryland, from out of Baltimore, and after arriving at the church that I was appointed to in 1988, we ended up paying off a mortgage on the church building that I came to. Actually, the mortgage was taken out about 3 years prior to my arrival, but 3.5 years after I arrived, we paid off a 30-year mortgage,
Wow.
$250,000, simply because I realized that we wanted to be able to use more money for ministry as
Right.
opposed to being encumbered by a mortgage and saddled for 30 years.
Right.
So with that in mind, that's what we did. But we moved out of that building because we outgrew it. We moved into a leased facility, and we wanted to use that property for ministry until such time as we ended up with a new permanent building. Something very interesting happened. At that new site, I went back to the same bank from which we had borrowed $250,000 and paid that off. And we had been with that bank for over 25 years.
Wow.
The congregation had. Well, when I went back to that bank and inquired about a $50,000 loan in order to do some renovation work in this property that we were now leasing, the response from the loan officer absolutely stunned me, simply because that individual said, well, we'll consider it. Consider it?
Consider it.
After our long-standing relationship.
Right, 25 years.
Not only that, but then the guy went on to tell me that we would have to take the property that we had paid off, the building, and said you'll have to use that as collateral for this $50,000, and 3 of your trustees will have to personally guarantee the loan. And I was so incensed by his response, I asked for the name of the president, and indeed the address to which I could send a letter, sent a letter to the president and CEO, detailing the length of our relationship with the bank and about the fact that we paid off a mortgage in 7 years. And I ended the letter by indicating that our 750 members will be very disappointed to learn of the bank's kind of behavior and response.
Yes.
That letter was mailed on a Tuesday. Jim, 3 days later, I'm coming back to my office. The executive vice president of the bank had left an urgent message for me to call her, and I did. And her first response was, Reverend Weaver, I wanted to let you know that I'm in receipt of the letter that you sent to our president, and your loan has been approved.
That was quick.
yeah, 72 hours.
After that, yeah.
And of course, the quickness was predicated on the fact that the president saw 750 members.
Instead of 1.
Absolutely.
That's right.
He saw numbers,
Yeah.
and he recognized that there could perhaps be some issues for the bank. Because quite frankly, Jim, I was fully prepared, if it had gone this far, on that Sunday to ask everybody that banked at that particular financial institution to stand. And I was going to tell them, take your money out of this bank.
Wow.
Because this is how they've treated the church to which you are a part of. And if they treat me this way and treat this church this way, what do you think they'll do to you?
Yeah.
And I didn't have to do that, thank God, that they came to their senses. But I also recognized, Jim, that we were not alone, that there were other congregations, other churches that were experiencing similar kinds of issues, and not just with that bank. Yeah. And so we finally came to the realization, a group of pastors in our area, that we could do so much more if we banded together.
Yes.
And that's how the collective banking group came into existence.
Wow.
Starting with initially 21 churches, but now here we are 15, 16 years later, we have 150 churches that make up our chapter and 250,000 people within our various churches. Power.
That's yeah, you're right. That's a good word. Powerful.
Marshalling.
That's exactly what it is. Yes, just working together, bringing your resources together, working cooperatively, supporting one another. All the things we talk about here on Blackonomics all the time. But I was just so excited about it when I first read about it back in the mid-1990s. And of course called you and talked to you, but we never met until around 2002 or so. I was just so excited that there was an organization, there was an initiative that had been established that realized and understood and then acted upon that understanding that there's power in numbers, there's strength in numbers, and we can leverage the reciprocity that we too often complain about not receiving. We can leverage the resources, the benefits that other groups gain simply by working together. And I was so impressed with that, and I'm just proud. I'm proud of the Collective Empowerment Group now. Back then, the Collective Banking Group, for having gotten together. And it's not, what impressed me was it wasn't just one, what can I say, set of churches. You have all different churches in this group, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that's what's sort of been the hallmark of the Collective Empowerment Group.
Yeah.
Simply because you have Baptist, AME Zion, Church of God in Christ, even non-denominational churches that make up our group. We've got churches as small as 30 members, but we also have congregations as large as 16,000.
Wow.
Simply because even the congregation of 16,000 sees the benefit of being a part of this collective, because when their members go into a financial institution inquiring about a mortgage, or a business person from our churches inquiring about additional capital for their business, they're able to say, not that they're part of a church with 16,000, yeah, but they're part of a larger group of 250,000 people. And it really does make a difference. Yeah. Yeah. And so, and again, the banks understand that this is a win-win proposition.
Oh, of course they do. Yeah.
So that's why they're more than happy to be a part of it.
And that's so important that we have to understand that as well. This is about business.
Absolutely.
I always talk to folks, and sometimes I get a little pushback, well, the church shouldn't be doing this, and we're not into that. That's that economic stuff you talk about, Jim, all the time. And I said, I understand what the church's role is. Definitely understand that, especially on Sunday. But on Monday, you give your money to somebody. You take your money and put it in somebody's bank. You go buy things at different folks' businesses. What do you get back from that? How is that being a good steward if you're not gaining some kind of reciprocity from the money that you sit in somebody's bank that is gaining interest that you're not getting? And then on top of that, you can't go get a loan. So the more we talk about this, I think it's really important for us to understand this is about business, and it's also about stewardship, and it gives us a stake in the economy when it comes to our numbers that we like to brag about when it comes to aggregate income, and the black community would be the 9th largest country and all of this. That doesn't matter if we don't use it collectively and leverage something back for our community. It makes no difference.
And I think a lot of people fail to realize that, for example, if we're talking about that we are spiritual people, the fact of the matter is Jesus talked about money more than he talked about love, more than he talked about faith. All one has to do is examine the scriptures throughout the New Testament, and you'll see how often Jesus is making reference to money. And so those of us within the church have to recognize that God has entrusted money to our care, and we ought to be managing it in such a way in which he would be well pleased. We ought to therefore be very careful about where we put our money into financial institutions, where we spend our money, to ensure that those retailers and those other businesses are indeed doing something to bring back some benefit back to the local economy. Too often, as you well know, Jim, we work someplace, we get the paycheck, and that money never gets recycled into our community. There are other communities that indeed recycle those dollars over and over again. And we need to do a better job within our community of doing that.
And what you said about the biblical implications, I mean, I thought about Matthew 25 with the parable of the talents.
Absolutely.
And it's about multiplying what you have, not just giving it away or burying it in the ground, so to speak, and not getting something back from it. So it is a scriptural effort, initiative, and it's biblical, so nobody can argue about that. I mean, it is, and I think, Pastor Weaver, that the church, as I know history, all of the things that we have started in the church. our schools, our
Insurance
benevolent
companies,
societies,
credit
insurance
unions.
companies, banks, credit, all these things started from the church. So part of my reasoning for wanting to get involved with this was that we need to get back to that. You know, we always, oh, that was a past, and oh, we don't need to deal with that. You can learn a lot from the past. I don't say live in the past, but learn from it and take those lessons and apply them where you can now, today. And I just look at the CEG as and then look back in history. I did a show called Looking Back and Moving Forward, that we can use those lessons and use those practices that our forebears used back then to establish entities. And now our charge is to grow those entities and to work closer together for our overall collective prosperity.
When you look at the institutions that used to be a hallmark within the African American community, black newspapers,
yes,
dying on the vine,
exactly, yep,
black colleges and universities,
oh, yes,
enrollment plummeted.
Going out of business. Yep.
So when you look at the one institution that is still a bedrock within our community, what is it? It's the church.
The church. Right.
And on any given Sunday, you've got sitting in that church a cook on that same pew with the doctor,
that's right,
with the engineer, with the agronomist, and so whatever the case is, and to be able to marshal those resources, as we've said many times before, on a Monday morning in this country, $50 million is deposited into banks from churches. That translates into $2.6 billion annually.
Wow.
And yet so often we are not finding a way to leverage those monies for the benefit of our communities.
Right.
And so that's, again, one of the reasons why the Collective Empowerment Group has come into existence. Now, again, it's more than just interfacing with the banks, and that's why we shifted that name to the Collective Empowerment Group.
Right.
Because we do represent more than simply trying to have a relationship with banks.
Yeah, and I want you to talk about that too, but before we get to that, I recall when I was there, the relationship that you had built with the banks. It's not an adversarial relationship. Like you said, it's a win-win situation. When I saw those bank presidents sitting at the gala, and I went to the Economic Empowerment Conference that you had as well, and I remember you introducing them, these words stick in my mind. You said, right from the stage, these are our banks, and you introduced all the presidents, you said, we support these banks, and we will continue to support these banks as long as they support us. And I mean, there was no outrage, there was no disdain for that. That's just real because it's business, and of all folks, they understand the business deal.
Sure.
You know?
Oh, absolutely.
And we need to understand that.
Well, and see, that's the problem, Jim, is that I think for so many people within our community, they've seen the banks being here, and they've seen themselves here. And so that they feel that this relationship is clearly favoring the banks. But we want the banks to understand, and that's what's happened within the Collective Empowerment Group. The banks see it as a real partnership.